Welcome to the second lecture in cost management. In this lecture we look at cost estimation, the three types of cost estimation, um, the idea that cost becomes clearer the more we progress throughout a project. So at the outset, at the pre-initiation phase, we get a rough order of magnitude for our cost estimate, and that narrows down for the planning phase, which becomes a definitive estimate. Budgeting is the idea that we do work at a particular time and resources are allocated to that work, and that gives us a cost budget. So you can see that when we create a budget, it's not just costs that we're interested in, we're interested in the scope and the schedule, which allows us to create a budget. And once we develop the cost baseline, that's the basis for our cost control, which is the topic of the third lecture. So there are three types of cost estimate. Analogous estimating uses previous projects of a similar type as a basis for estimating the cost of this project. It's a top-down approach, and you can see that it's probably of a low level of accuracy. So you look at a project that is similar, and that's your basis for the template for the cost estimate for this project. And then you look at components of this project. You say, well, this will cost more because we're in a different jurisdiction, and the government fees and charges are higher here. Or this will cost less because we're in a time of soft labour. So if we went back to maybe to 2007, very competitive labour market, very high costs. Not so much since 2008. Bottom-up estimate is the most accurate, and that's where you develop your work packages, you assign labour and materials, internal labour and external labour, as well as materials and overheads to each work package, and that gives you a bottom-up estimate. So you add up all the costs of every work package until you get an overall estimate for the project. So you can see that the accuracy and the timing will change. So right at the beginning, at the business case or the pre-initiation phase, before we begin to scope up this project, we're not going to have a very clear idea of what this project will cost. So prior to project initiation, we might have what we call a rough order of magnitude, an ROM. Okay, and that could be quite wide. One of the estimates that is in PMBOK is from minus 25%. So the level of accuracy is low. We could be overestimating by 25%, or we could be underestimating by 70%. So the actual cost of the project, whatever we estimate, the actual cost could be 70% higher. So really it's not a firm, accurate estimate of the cost, but it's something to start with, so that's a rough order of magnitude. When we start defining the scope and negotiating with stakeholders through the initial estimate, we may get a cost budget. This is where we start thinking, well, the cost of the bridge will be so much. This is where we start getting budget approvals in our project charter, and that order of level of accuracy is sometimes from minus 10% to plus 25%. The process that we've been working with is the bottom-up approach. That's when we assign labour and materials to every activity that occurs on the project. Each one of those activities adds up to be a work package, and the work package is costed. So when we add up all the work packages that occur on the project, we get a bottom-up approach. And that's a definitive estimate. That's the one we baseline, and typically we're thinking that's within 5 to 10%. So we could have overestimated by 5% or underestimated by 10%. All those concepts, the analogy cost estimate, the parametric cost estimate, and the bottom-up approach, as well as the rough order of magnitude, the budgeting, and the definitive cost estimates, they're covered in here in a short video by Joseph Phillips, talking about how you might how these concepts are taught with the PMP exam or the PMBOK, which is the project management body of knowledge that we're working from. So take a quick look at that and then come back to the remainder of the lecture. So we're back. We've just heard about the three cost estimates, the analogy. That's when we look at something that's similar, a project that's simpler. So you can imagine here, whatever this component is of the project. We don't know what the work package, we haven't planned the work packages, we don't know this. Okay, but we look at something that's occurred that is similar, and we use that as a template to estimate what all these activities might cost. We may think our project might cost a little bit more or a little bit less, so we might make small variations. But the analogous cost estimate technique is to take a template from a similar project and adjust it at the edges. It's the least accurate. Parametric is when you've got something that's fairly standardized, so cost per unit. However, it is used in construction where quantity surveyors have sort of looked at what it actually costs, and they've looked at the materials and the labour, and they've looked at previous projects, and what they do is they're able to fold all that cost in per square metre or per unit length, whatever it happens to be. So you can imagine building a floor or the framework of a second story building, where you need to include the steel, the concrete, all the things that go into building that second story. That's been looked at by a quantity surveyor, and they're able to give a parametric estimate of cost per square foot for estimating the cost of building a second story. So there are different methods. Parametric estimate needs something that's quite defined, something that's been done over and over and over again, where a quantity surveyor can lump those costs of the materials and labour for a project that's similar. An analogy is when you have a project that is similar and you need experience in the room to measure up and down. And finally, a well-planned project. So at the baseline, we'll have costs for all the work packages. And what you do is you add up those costs to get a total cost. And that's why it's called bottom-up. Because we don't know what this is, the analogy is to use a top-down approach. So each of those, one by one, analogous estimation looks at similar projects and uses that as a starting point. It requires experience of performing similar projects. You can't use a template if that template doesn't exist. And it needs to know what the actual costs were, not somebody else's project plan, but the actual costs of those projects. You then need some knowledge in the room to help determine where the current project differs from the previous project, and you make adjustments accordingly. And finally, not just the ability to tell the difference, but that experience with the methods that we used in the previous project. So sort of knowledge of what was done before and how our project differs. The parametric estimate basically is a technique that uses well-defined component parts of the project, such as cost per ore or cost per digging. If it's excavating, then there should be a parametric estimate for every 10 metres of excavating for a rail line costs so much, and that includes not the cost of just of digging out the soil, but it includes the cost of labour, preparing, so all the things that go into making or laying 10 metres of railway line will be costed into a parametric. So when people say, 1 kilometre of road costs $100,000 or $500,000 if it's a freeway, that includes preparing the soil, bitumising the soil, the concrete underneath, the labour, the materials that are required. So that's parametric estimate. Finally, bottom-up estimate which we've talked about before, is this idea of allocating cost to each one of those work packages and then adding it up. So what are the cost management activities? Well, the first one, which was one of our processes, is estimating cost. The next lecture covers, or the next part of this lecture covers cost budgeting. That is, once we've gone down a work breakdown structure, we've allocated all those activities, materials and labour and a cost, we come up with a baseline. That's how we measure out the performance of the project in terms of cost. Cost control is controlling changes to the project, so correcting for variations between the baseline and the actual work that occurs. The cost management plan, so planning costs, is a document that keeps, it's a document that records how estimation will be done, what costs are considered, and how cost control will be done. So here we've got cost by work package, and this is our bottom-up approach. This is where we look at each work package. We'll take negotiating skills training. Here we have internal labour, and that's the cost of internal labour. So that's 300 hours at $50 an hour, and that's where we get the 16,500. We also have a subcontractor, so we have 300 hours of external labour, and that's where the $45,000 come from. We will also need some non-labour or materials, and that's the $50,000. So the budget for this project is just under $1 million. However, that doesn't, yes it does. So that's made up of $903,000 of estimated cost and 10% reserve cost. That could be held by the sponsor to accommodate for risks that occur in the project, or it might be a profit margin in a fixed contract. Really, when we're baselining, we need to include schedule. So we include what scope is being delivered, so our work package, here it is here. But when is that scope delivered? So our schedule. So a cost baseline includes both the what is being done and when it's being done. And this way we can start controlling our cash flow. So you can imagine that if we're getting periods of funding, that first period to undertake the first 3 months of work really only needs about $60,000. But we need funding of around about $600,000 for the next 3 months. So you can see that by dividing this work up by time, you can start controlling the cash flow that's required on this project. Alright, so that's the conclusion of this lecture. We looked at 3 methods of cost estimation. That's analogy, parametric, and bottom-up approach. We talked about clarifying costs, so the rough order of magnitude, the project budget, and finally the definitive cost. And that definitive cost works with scope and time to become a cost baseline, and that's what is the agreed costing of the project. This is when the project will spend money, and this is what the project will spend money on. In the next lecture, we'll look at controlling that cost.